So George turned around and said, and they turned around and said, can we go and have a look at it? And they turned around and said, well, we can see there's some work. And Mo turned around and said, oh, by the way. So John turned around and said, well, Mo turned around and said to John, and it's not the colour that she turned around and said. And she turned around and said, what the hell have you done? So he turned around and said, well, you wanted me to paint the ceiling. So she basically turned around and said, you're going to have to do a repaint. So Mo turned around and said, and she turned around and explained to the other three. She turned around and said, no. Ken turned around and said, I'd always promised. And he turned around and said, fancy starting a band, Pete? I basically turned around and said, want to form a band? Ken turned around and said, yeah, they agree. I said, there's only one. So he looked at me and he turned around and said, well, and, turned around and said, we're going to start a band. She turned around and said, well, first of all, coerced him and turned around and said, you want to play bass? And he turned around and said, no. And they turned around and said, Alan. So he turned around and said, even when Paul turned around and said, and he basically turned around and said, yes. So we turned around and said, so they turned around and then we turned around and said, okay. And we turned around and said, where are we staying? And he turned around and said, this is where you're going to stay. So we turned around and said, and he turned around and said, this is where, So we turned around and said, what about lights? So John, to his greatest taste, right, turned around and said, got a black mug. And he turned around and said, we're the Beatles. So we turned around to one and said, okay. And Cosmeter turned around and said, oh, yeah, fine. So the police in their wisdom turned around and said, I suppose you could turn around and say 7 hours. And he turned around and said, Mo, because as he turns around and says, we've turned around and said, we got a better deal. He defiantly turned around and said, well, and we basically turned around and said, we're the Beatles, They basically turned around and said, well, yes. So we turned around and said, what? So he turned around and said, yes. Bruno Cosmedes turned around and said that you, hey McCartney. So we turned around and said, well, that's a load of BS there. I suppose you could turn around and say prison scene, We basically looked at one of them and turned around and said, the best thing we can do. She turned around and said, to actually turn around and get told, basically have a conversation with him where he turns around and says, I want to sign you. And he basically turned around and said, have you got my Bonnie by the Beatles? So Epstein turned around and said, who are the Beatles? This guy had basically come in and turned around and said, the Beatles. And he basically turned around and said, rapes, and turned around and said, yeah, no strings attached. We went back and turned around and said, there's one camp which turns around and says that a record contract, and there's another camp which turns around and said no. He basically turned around and said, Pete, what's this? He basically talked around the subject for a while and then turned around very apologetically, I suppose that's the word, turned around and said, Pete, he said, I have bad news for you. I suppose you'd turn around and say you're shell-shocked. He basically turned around and said, well, they feel Ringo's a better drummer. And as I've always turned around and said that was a matter of opinion. And Mo turned around and said, well, I'm not happy with that. He turned around and said, in hindsight, people are most probably going to turn around and say, oh. And he phoned me and he turned around and said, Peter, so at that stage, he turned around and said, you will get an offer from Apple. Don't quote me because there's anoraks out there who'll turn around and say, no, it wasn't, it was so many tracks. Carry a slogan turning around and saying, who I am. Generations have always turned around and said, as you just turned around and said, 5 generations.